It's gone because I'm sharing my screen, I think.
All
All
set.
right, it looks like we're recording and people are answering the poll question, which was, what is your connection to Cross Lake? So you should have a window that has popped up with all the choices. I'll read those out once we have most everyone voting. It's about 10 people that haven't voted. All right, last chance to vote. All right, most of you answered. So it looks like 48% of you own a seasonal camp on the lake, you or your family. 45% have a year-round property on the lake. And then nobody selected that they do not own any property, but use the lake for recreation and fishing. Nobody has no connection to the lake. And then there are 7% of you who chose other. And so you can go in the chat if you want to and let us know what other is for you. All right, so then we have our second poll question. If you want to advance the slide to question number 2. About how long have you had a connection to Cross Lake? There's a few choices there, so just pick the one that fits best. You can estimate if you need to, roughly. Looks like someone in the chat says they did not receive the ability to answer questions. There should be a screen that pops up, but depending on the device you're using, it might not let you do that, or it might not be visible. So sorry about that if you aren't seeing these. Yeah, on an iPad. Yeah. Might be behind your screen or something, might not be easy to see. Someone suggested turning off your pop-up blocker. That could help. All right, so it looks like most everyone had a chance to vote. So how long have you had a connection to Cross Lake? About 7% said less than 1 year, 10%, 1 to 5 years, 7%, 5 to 10 years, 17%, 10 to 20 years. The majority of you at 59% have had a connection for over 20 years. 0% had no connection. All right, so thanks for voting. We'll move on to question number 3. Yep, and so that is, are you a member of Friends of Cross Lake? Most of you have already voted, so get your answer in. Okay, great. And polling. So are you a member of Friends of Cross Lake? 69% say yes, that's great. 6% no, 6% are unsure, 19% are not currently, but might want to join later. All right, thanks. And then we just have one last poll question until we start with the main part of the presentation. And this question is, how would you describe Cross Lake's water quality? So choose one that you think fits the best for your perception of the water quality. There's quite a few choices.
I can see it when.
Okay, we'll give you a few more seconds to get your vote in. I know there's a lot of choices to read through. Looks like most everyone has voted. Okay. So the results are, how would you describe Cross Lake's water quality? 0% of people said excellent. 0% said it's fine and has been fine. 13% say about the same as always, but not good. The majority of people at 63% said used to be better, but it's getting worse. 7% said it was worse before, but getting better. 17% were not sure. 0% said do not care. All right, I'll be back for some more poll questions later, and we'll get going with the rest of the presentation.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Jen Jesperson. I'll be kicking off the morning talking about water quality and Cross Lake's physical characteristics. Yeah, it was interesting to see the results of that last question, or mostly because I think that the education and outreach that Friends of Cross Lake is doing must be working, because you guys seem to have some knowledge about the quality of the lake. And so my presentation this morning will probably help tell you whether what you responded to in that question is on target. So I will be talking about water quality, the water quality of lake this morning first, and then later this morning I'll be talking about the watershed modeling. So when assessing water quality, it's really important to consider the physical characteristics of both the lake and the watershed. But for this section, I'll be focusing on the lake characteristics. So as part of this project, a bathymetric survey was conducted to create a new bathymetric map for the lake, which you can see here. So the bathymetry of a lake is really the contours of the lake, kind of like thinking of it as a reverse mountain. So the pink areas are the deepest areas of the lake, kind of go down through the middle. And then the shallower areas are represented in the light blue around the edges of the lake. This information is critical to updating our knowledge about the nutrient dynamics in the lake. So how does phosphorus move through the lake? And also about understanding the volume of the water at different depths in the lake that we can use to combine with our water quality data to give us more information about the health of the lake. So Cross Lake is the third lake in the East Branch of the Fish River chain of lakes. And one thing that's important when we're thinking about lakes is where's the water coming from in the watershed that flows into the lake, and where does the water go? So for Cross Lake, there are three major tributaries. It's through the Mud Lake thoroughfare, which receives water from upstream Long Lake. And then there's two other primary or tributaries on the north end of the lake, which is Dickey Brook and Daigle Brook. And then water flows through Cross Lake and out into Square Lake, which then flows north up the Fish River and into the St. John River, which eventually, going along the Canadian border, empties out into the Bay of Fundy in the Atlantic Ocean. So it's really important then when we're thinking about water quality in the context of Cross Lake that we also remember that the quality of our water also affects the downstream waters. So the water quality coming out of Cross Lake has a direct and immediate impact on the downstream water quality in Square. So stay on that one more second, Cheryl.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. So in terms of size, Cross Lake is 2,479 acres. It's considered a great pond. Great ponds in Maine are anything greater than 10 acres in size. So this is a good sized lake. The maximum depth is 46 feet. And I'll be presenting some results today in terms of meters. To put it in context, the maximum depth of 46 feet is about 14 meters deep. And the average depth of 19 feet is just under 6 meters. The lake's flushing rate is 3.5 times per year. And flushing rate is really how many times per year the entire volume of the lake is replenished. So think of it as a big bathtub draining 3.5 times every year. So the higher the flushing rate, the faster the water is going to flow through the lake. On average, Maine lakes flush between 1 and 1.5 times a year. Typically, you think of like a spring and fall where there's more rain coming in and flushing it. So it's a little bit higher than the flushing rate on average for large lakes in Maine. So our current knowledge about water quality, how it's changed or not changed, is really based on the data collected by volunteers dating back to 1981. So statewide, volunteer monitoring kind of kicked off in the early 70s. So in Cross Lake, go ahead, Cheryl. We have records back to 1981. So we really have a good long 40-year data set. And for those of you that are older, I'm a little bit older myself, so I think of 80s doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was 40 years ago. So that gives us a good time record to look at data. In 2004, Cross Lake was listed by Maine DEP as not meeting state water quality standards due to non-point source pollution. And we'll talk about non-point source pollution throughout the presentation. And this was followed by a TMDL, or total maximum daily load report, and a phosphorus control action plan that was prepared by Maine DEP for impaired water bodies, which has to be approved by the US Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. That was approved in 2006. Between 2006 and 2015, there was very little data collected at Cross Lake. And then in 2019, Friends of Cross Lake started doing their Secchi Blitz program, which many of you may be involved with, to get volunteers out collecting data across the lake. A watershed survey was conducted in 2019, as well as intensive monitoring of the lake in 2020 by Friends of Cross Lake, and development of the management plan that we are speaking about today. So this aerial view of Cross Lake shows the location of Station 1, which is the deepest location on the lake. There's 32 years of data across that 40-year time span at Station 1. And that data is collected primarily between May and October, or we call the open water season, when there's no ice on the lake. I will point out the chocolatey brown color on the north end of the lake. And that is an image of a sediment plume that's coming in from Dickey Brook in May 2011. It's probably not uncommon in the spring when some fields are bare and there's a lot of agriculture in the watershed, that a lot of sediment may be discharged directly into the lake like this. Just so happened that the Google Earth satellite was heading over the lake at the time that this was occurring. So the goals of the water quality analysis was to assess water quality conditions and evaluate the long-term trends, and to help set the water quality goal for the watershed management plan. We want to set a reasonable water quality goal for this plan, and I'll talk more about that later today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trophic state indicators. So it's a big jumble of words. Trophic state is kind of characterized by several different water quality parameters that I'm going to be presenting today, which include water clarity, which is measured by Secchi disk, so Secchi disk transparency, or SDT. It's one of the most useful ways to determine if a lake is changing from year to year, and it's an international method of measurement. So it's used all across the world to determine how clear lakes are and how healthy they are based on their clarity. Clarity can be affected by things like turbidity, so sediment that's washed into the lake, or natural tannins in the water from vegetation along the shoreline and in the watershed, as well as algae. So you can see in this little image that the more algae or sediment that's in the water, the less clear your reading is going to be. And so the smaller your Secchi disk reading would be, and the depth going down from the surface to the bottom. The second trophic state indicator is total phosphorus. We'll talk a lot about phosphorus. The focus of the management plan really is on phosphorus. It includes both organic forms of phosphorus and inorganic types of phosphorus. And phosphorus data is collected using an integrated core of water. From the top of the, can you show that graph, Cheryl? I think just one more. Keep going, there you go, okay. So this is a graph showing, an image showing the different layers of the lake during the summer. When the lake stratifies, we have really warm water at the top because that's where sunlight penetrates. And then we have deeper, colder water at the bottom of the lake where the sun cannot penetrate. So when we take a phosphorus core sample, we're collecting water in the epilimnion, so that warmer surface water. And phosphorus is measured in parts per billion. So 1 part in a billion parts. It's a very small amount that's being measured. And then chlorophyll A is a measure of the green pigment found in all plants, including microscopic plants like algae. It's also collected using an integrated core like phosphorus to the depth at which sunlight penetrates. It's also measured in parts per billion. And then dissolved oxygen is another key water quality parameter. It's collected along with temperature. So it's a meter it's lower down. Every meter a reading is taken that collects dissolved oxygen and temperature readings. And it changes it records the levels of oxygen in the water over the course of the open water season, and it's measured in parts per million. Typically, oxygen is produced in the upper part of the lake where the wind and the waves mix up the water, and then also where photosynthesis is occurring. So oxygen is depleted at the bottom of the lake due to decomposition of organic matter. And then when the lake stratifies, that thermal stratification, the change in the temperature gradient actually prevents well-oxygenated water at the top of the lake from getting down into the bottom. So it results in loss of oxygen in the bottom of the lake during the course of the summer, which unfortunately sometimes can result in phosphorus from being released from the sediments that have built up in the bottom of the lake. Go ahead. All right, so this chart is probably hard for you guys to see, but it gives you a snapshot of how much data was collected at which locations in the lake and which of those trophic states parameters I just mentioned. So going across the top are the years that data was collected, and then down the left side are the parameters that were measured at each station, so phosphorus and transparency. So the bulk of the data was collected at Station 1, again, 32 years of data. Station 2, very limited data, it's only 6 years of data, mostly in the 70s and 80s. And then Station 3, there's 2 years of data. So this is a new station that Friends of Cross Lake has been collecting data at the last couple of years. You'll see that there are several years in which no data was collected at the lake, on the lake at all, including a big chunk of time between 2010 and 2015. So this made it difficult for us to assess the short-term trends over the last 10 years. So our analysis focused on just Station 1 data and over the historical monitoring period back to 1981. So the first results I'd like to share with you is for the Secchi disk transparency. And we had 31 years of data. So it's a pretty robust data set. And again, we're missing a chunk of that 2010 to 2015.
Oops, sorry, Jen.
So the Secchi disk transparency reading over the course of the historical period ranges from 0.9 meters. You see that in 1984, that was the shallowest reading. So if you picture this graph, 0 represents the top of the water where you'd be sitting in your boat. And then the bottom of the graph is with depth. So as the line goes down, you're getting deeper in the water. And this graph specifically is the minimum transparency for each year. So years across the bottom, each line representing 1 year of record. And the red line in the graph is the 2 meters mark. So typically, if you have Secchi disk transparencies less than 2 meters, it's indicative of an algal bloom or algae bloom might be occurring. So you can see that in Cross Lake, these blue lines are above that red line in 16 of the 31 years measured, meaning that there was possibility that there were blooms occurring in half of the years on record. And then on average, the water clarity in Cross Lake is 2.7 meters. Put that in perspective, statewide, the water clarity is 4.8 meters. Okay, and then the next one is looking at the long-term trend. So the graph is now sort of flipped where the surface is at the bottom and then the deeper part of the lake is at the top of the graph. The statistical analysis shows us that the average annual, this is average annual now, Secchi disk readings are getting deeper over time. So in the 1980s, they were consistently at or below 2 meters, and now they're closer to 3 meters. You can kind of see the line going up. This may be directly linked with improvements in agricultural practices in the watershed or less precipitation during the summer, because when we have less runoff, there's less soil and other things getting into the lake. Or it could be a result of collecting more readings over the course of the more recent time. So we have more readings over a longer period of time so that, like say you collect readings in May and June before the water quality gets changes to more algal dominated lake, that could increase the average of the annual number, if that makes sense. So the jury is really still out on why that's changing. So chlorophyll, we have 23 years of data ranging from 0.9 meters in 1989 to in 2019 to 53 parts per billion in 1986. So this figure shows the average for each year, which is the light green, as well as the highest reading for each year in the dark green. So notice the spike of chlorophyll A in the 1980s, which is directly correlated to the low water clarity. Remember, the more algae in the water, the lower the clarity readings. And we see low water clarity where we see high levels of chlorophyll A. So typically the highest levels of chlorophyll A in Cross Lake occur in late August when water temperatures warmed up and the nutrients and sunlight are readily available to thrive.
Jen, can you explain what chlorophyll is?
Yeah, I thought I did that earlier. So it's a measure of the green pigment that's found in plants.
Yeah, maybe you did. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's always good to have a refresher. So chlorophyll A in Cross Lake on average is 10 parts per billion, which is considered elevated. So the probability of having an algal bloom increases when this number is above 8 parts per billion. And you can see in this graph that they are over 8 parts per billion for many years on record. Statewide, the average is 5.4. And then phosphorus, which we'll be talking a lot more about in the presentation, is presented here as the annual average. And you can see there's more gaps in the data for phosphorus because most of the phosphorus data is collected by Maine DEP and they don't get out every year to do that. So it's great that you guys have a monitoring program now that can do this type of work. So the range in the full data set is from 6 parts per billion, which was in 1994, up to 30 parts per billion in 1986. Historical average is 16 parts per billion. And then over the last 4 years, the average is just a little higher, 17 parts per billion. For comparison, the statewide average is 12 parts per billion. And like I mentioned, that typically if we get above 10, we're starting to see water quality impacts. So you guys are around 17, and that's why you're seeing water quality impacts. There is no significant trend in the phosphorus data. And we'd like to say, and statistically, it's remained relatively stable, despite the fact that there's periods of annual variation. So lakes occur on a spectrum from very clear, clean lakes with low nutrients, with a healthy population of cold water fish, and to lakes on the other end of the spectrum that are high in nutrients, very productive, lots of vegetative growth. You can forward the slide, Cheryl. I think there's some animations, yeah. And warm water fish. And so the middle photo, one more, is a picture of Cross Lake on October 10th, 2020. And you can see that there's definitely some green going on in the lake. Phosphorus levels greater than 10 increase the probability of algal blooms. This doesn't mean a full bloom will occur, but it could result in more localized blooms like this, where you'd see green scum along the shoreline in certain areas of the lake. And then what I wanted to show kind of was where you are on the spectrum of from very clear to the pea soup. You're on the high end of, moving towards the pea soup. And so the goal of the watershed management plan is really to move that arrow down the scale to the left, closer to the low nutrient end of things. But we have a ways to go. If we look at what's called the trophic state index, this is a calculation that DEP uses. This one is based on the Secchi disc readings that were collected, and unproductive lakes are less than 31 on the TSI scale, whereas productive lakes are greater than 61. The last calculated number for Cross Lake is 84, so well above the productive number that DEP uses for classifying their lakes. I think that's it for me. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Amanda, and please put your questions about what I talked about in the chat box so we can remember them later.
All right, so here's your next poll question. During your time at the lake, have you felt concerned about any of the following? And this is a multiple choice question, so you can pick all that apply. Hopefully you're all seeing that and able to pick. There we go.
It's
There's a little bit of a delay there. Guess people had to read a bit. There's a lot of choices. All right, we'll give you a few more seconds. So get those votes in. Okay. Looks like everyone that voted said that they are concerned about algae blooms or green scum along the shoreline. 92% worry about the safety of swimming or letting their pets in the water when it's green. 64% are concerned about excessive plant growth, 52% poor fishing for salmon and trout in the summer. 24% poor fishing during the winter. 68% were concerned about invasive plants. 92% are concerned about the future lake water quality for kids and grandkids. And we didn't get any for other or not concerned about any of the above. So thanks for voting. We have a few more slides before the next poll question.
Go ahead, Cheryl. Okay, so impacts of algae blooms. It sounds like many of you are very concerned about this, about swimming and recreating when the lake has some green tinge to it. So it's true, algal blooms can result in non-desirable conditions. DEP calls them nuisance algal blooms, which can affect our ability to recreate, swimming, boating. It can change the aesthetics of the lake. So instead of looking at a blue lake, we're looking at a green lake. And it can also affect your property value. Harmful algal blooms, which are also called HABs, or HABs, are a result of cyanotoxins, which are produced by cyanobacteria. These toxins can damage the liver or nervous system, produce gastrointestinal symptoms, or cause the skin irritation. I'm not saying this to scare you guys. I'm just putting this information out there so you're aware that these things do have side effects. And this is a big reason why we want to fix it, right? So the DEP conducted a study in 2014 of 7 Maine lakes that were experiencing algal blooms. And what they found was that the highest counts of cyanotoxins were located in the downwind scum. So the stuff that's accumulating along the shore that's very concentrated. These levels were above the World Health Organization's recreational standard. Microcystin is the most toxic and prevalent cyanotoxin in the Northeast. I would encourage everyone to go to the Maine DEP's website. They have a wealth of information about more about cyanotoxins and cyanobacteria. But the bottom line is if there's an algal bloom, don't swim, water ski, or boat in areas where the algae are visible. Don't let your pets or livestock swim or drink the water if it's discolored, if you see foam or scum or mats of algae on the water. And if you swim or wade in water that has dense algae present, make sure you rinse off with water and soap if it's available as soon as possible. And of course, don't drink the lake water during a bloom. I know some people around the state still have water that's hooked up to their water, their sinks. Boiling the water does not help it. It actually makes it worse. It releases the toxins. So don't think that boiling your water is going to help with that. Go ahead. So some of you on this call are probably involved with the Friends of Cross Lake Secchi Blitz. The Blitz began in 2019 and is expected to go through next summer. So this summer and next summer, I think is the goal. Volunteers team up to collect water clarity readings across the lake, which really allows a more complete picture of water quality than just data from that deep hole at Station 1. We can see the variability and clarity across the lake. Biweekly samples are also collected in 2020 at the Mud Lake Thoroughfare, and then stormwater samples. So when it's raining, capturing what's coming off of or through Dickey Brook during a storm event. Additional monitoring is also conducted at stations 1 and 3. Okay. And so dissolved oxygen is the last or final trophic state that I want to talk about first this morning. And it's really important to measure for several reasons. So cold water fish need dissolved oxygen greater than 5 parts per million to survive and to thrive. You can see here, it's shown as the onset of hypoxia is that 5 parts per million on the graph. See all the happy fish on the other side of that line? So below that line, we're anoxia, which is less than 2 parts per million. That lack of oxygen can result in fish kills, which I know you guys experienced in the this past year, in fact. When the oxygen levels plummeted, the fish did not have time to escape to more well-oxygenated water, and they die. Anoxia can also result in the release of phosphorus from the sediments providing food for algae. So DO, or dissolved oxygen, correlates with increasing water temperature. So in early spring and late fall, the lake is very well mixed from the top to the bottom with higher levels of oxygen. But when the lake begins to warm up in the summer, typically between June and September, there's a big drop off in the oxygen levels in the deep areas of Cross Lake. So right now, Cross Lake experiences anoxia, or lack of oxygen, as shallow as 7 meters in the lake. And it has been as low as 5 parts per million in the 1980s. Or not parts per million, sorry, meters, 5 meters in depth. All right, so in terms of figuring out where the phosphorus is coming from in the lake, we look at the watershed, where's the soil and everything coming in, how much of that. We also want to identify how much phosphorus might be coming up from the bottom sediments, because when that soil comes in from the watershed, it deposits, if it doesn't get flushed out, it gets deposited in the bottom of the lake, and that builds up over time. So we can use the dissolved oxygen profiles and couple it with the phosphorus data to determine where the most phosphorus is in the water column. So if P is being released from the sediment and there's no oxygen at the bottom of the lake, that's what we call internal loading. So the different colors on this figure represent the different layers of the lake, which indicate the greatest mass of phosphorus is in the surface of the lake. So the thicker the layer, that represents more phosphorus. So the blue area here is the surface of the lake, and you can see there's more phosphorus in the surface 2 layers of the lake compared to the bottom of the lake, which is this tiny little fraction of green and an orange at the bottom of the lake. This tells us that internal loading is not a large source of phosphorus in Cross Lake and not a priority for management this time, whereas the phosphorus coming from the watershed that's contributing to the surface load is.
All right, so that leads us to our next poll question. Question is, we now know Cross Lake isn't as healthy as it should be, that phosphorus is the cause, and it isn't mainly from internal recycling. So this question is asking you, where do you think the phosphorus is coming from? And this is another multiple choice question. So pick any that you think apply. Looks like about half of you have voted, so we'll give you a few more seconds if you want to put in some answers. Just a few more seconds. Okay. So the results are 61% think septic systems contribute phosphorus, 96% each for soil erosion and fertilizer, 21% pet waste, and actually 21% atmosphere and 21% waterfowl. All right, so thank you for that. We can move on.
Kathy, you gonna, yes, thank you.
If I get this to respond. There we go.
What's the delay?
Kathy Hoppy, Maine DEP. It's great to see a lot of you again. I've been working, actually my first project in Aroostook County after moving here was on Cross Lake 32 years ago. So I am familiar with the lake. So to get to follow up on where is that phosphorus coming from, because we need to know where it's coming from in order to stop it from coming into the lake. We'll see how you guys did. So typically, one of the sources is point source, which is a direct pipe, something like the wastewater treatment plant at Fort Kent or St. Agat or Fraser Paper up in Madawaska. There's a discharge pipe to water. It's licensed by the Maine DEP. There are none in the Cross Lake watershed, so it's not coming from there. 1% is coming from the gulls and the wildlife, the loons, the geese that land on the lake or whatever. Not much we're going to do about them. 1% from septic systems. So your septic systems and your geese are about the same. A bit about septic systems. You can reduce, one of the ways you can reduce the chances that septic systems are contributing phosphorus is if you have a system that's older than 1974, you do not have one that was designed to current standards. So you might want to consider replacing it. Also, most septic systems only last about 20 years if they're used year round. So like when you're considering replacing your roof or your furnace or whatever, you do have to think that it's not going to last forever. You're going to have to replace it at some point. But to extend the life, if you pump it every 3 to 5 years, your system will last longer and you'll be less likely to add phosphorus to your lake. 2%, Jen has already talked about coming from internal recycling. 2% it comes from the atmosphere, and that leaves a whopping 94% coming into the lake when it rains and the snow melts. And over the last week, or it's almost 2 weeks now, we've seen a lot of melting going on here in Aroostook County, a lot of runoff. Then we had the rain on snow event last night, and I know I've got water running through my fields. Running across roads, ditches, your property, 94% of watershed runoff or stormwater runoff. You've heard Jen talk a little bit. I'm going to get into it more, the direct watershed and indirect watershed. When we break it out, 55% comes from the direct watershed and 39% comes from the indirect watershed. So where's this phosphorus that's coming off when it rains and the snow melts? Well, fertilizers, some of you I know fertilizers. So that can come from your lawn, your garden, agriculture, are all sources of fertilizer where people apply fertilizers. Manure, that's not just the cows and the horses, but it can also include pet waste. There's another source. And then soil erosion. And soil is the most common for Maine lakes, and it's also the big source for Cross Lake. So where is that soil coming from? Well, it comes from our driveways. It might look like a stable driveway, but I tell people if you stood at the top of your driveway and let a beach ball go, if it's going down to the lake, that's where the water and the soil is going too. And small particles get moved even when it looks like your driveway is stable, and those small soil particles have phosphorus attached to them. It also comes from your eroding shoreline. And I go along like Mist Lane and that side of the lake, you have some pretty good shoreline erosion. And it also can come from, you don't think about it, but the roof runoff, there's a concentrated water coming off and hitting where the roof runoff is, and sometimes you'll see trenches there. That's dislodging soil particles and getting them moving too. And there's no buffer on this camp right here. And it's not on Cross Lake. I deliberately picked images not on Cross Lake, so I didn't pick on anybody. But there's no vegetation or buffer filtering out the impacts from that camp and the lake. It can also come from forestry operations. Sometimes logging roads can be a good source, even if they aren't actively in their logging anymore. As we've all seen, some really intense storm events can come along and cause some erosion of non-active forestry sites, but you can also get it on an active forest site. It comes from camp roads or logging roads. and of course, agriculture. So all the land uses, everything that's happening in the watershed where soil is exposed has a good chance of it not just getting moving, but to keep moving and getting washed into the lake. So what is this watershed we're talking about? What's this land area? It's really large for Cross Lake. It's 58 square miles. This is the direct watershed we're going to talk about here. It includes 4 towns and 4 townships. Dickey and Daigle Brook and the Mud Lake Thoroughfare are your big streams coming in, but you do have some small streams. If you walk your camp road, you'll see cross culverts connecting water moving from one side of the road to the other. Some of those are just for ditches, but some are small streams. 45% of the watershed is forested. 29% is wetlands. 23% is agriculture. 3% is development, and most of that development is along the lake shore. It's the camps or the residents on the shoreline. And there's about 280 camp owners or residents along the lake. So back to this direct and indirect watershed. The nice pretty colors here, this is the direct watershed that we're talking about with the thoroughfare from Mud Lake, Dickey and Daigle Brooks. Oops. The indirect watershed is that big gray area, the land that drains to Long Lake or Mud Lake, that eventually influences Cross Lake, just like Cross Lake, and actually all 3 of these lakes impact Square Lake and then Eagle Lake. So the indirect watershed, while it has influence on Cross Lake, the bigger influence you'll see, especially when Jen gets into modeling, is from the direct watershed, which is how lakes work generally. So we talked a little bit stormwater runoff, all the land area that's draining to Cross Lake has the potential to carry soil with it, which is carrying phosphorus. Every time it rains, the snow melts, it gets exposed soil moving. And so all this land is draining down to Cross Lake. So we know generally where it's coming from. It's the soil that's coming from the watershed, that 58 square miles. It's the general land uses, the exposed soil, but where are these specific sites if we're going to fix them? And that's something that many of you participated in with the 2019 Watershed Survey. A great group of people, impressive work was done. And in the process, you guys identified 154 non-point source sites, specific sites, mostly in the residential area. You'll see 121 of the sites were residential in the watershed. I should point out that forestry, although it was slightly surveyed, it really wasn't, enough data wasn't intense enough to include the data, and agriculture was handled completely by another process. So of these 154 sites, how many of them were really serious sites or high priority sites? Well, 36% were, and only 53%, I'm echoing here. And the estimated cost, 18% were considered pretty expensive, while the majority of them aren't real expensive to fix. So that gives us some target and some idea of how we can reduce some of that phosphorus. Cheryl and Kirk, because they didn't have enough to do, went out in 2020 and checked the sites, the road sites, and they figured out, they resurveyed them, and they found that of the 15 road sites that were identified in the survey were now either fixed or showed no active erosion. 9 of the residential sites were already fixed. Kudos to those who are already taking the leap and fixing erosion problems. And in all this process, Kirk and Cheryl collected additional data and figured out the phosphorus load to the lake from these 126 total sites. And they came up with 5.5 kilograms per year from these erosion sites of phosphorus going into your lake. at 4.7 from shoreline erosion and 0.8 from roads. So it's 80%. I'm going to delay here. Cheryl, it's not advancing.
Oh, I didn't click anything. Waiting for Kathy, it says.
I didn't.
There, you got it. You got it.
Okay. So the agricultural piece. There's a national program called National Water Quality Initiative. It's about 15 years old now, not quite. It's a partnership between the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency and state agencies. So this is a national program. And each year, states they're required to designate 2 water bodies that are impaired to encourage voluntary conservation efforts that are agriculturally related. The whole idea is to accelerate the conservation practices happening in a watershed for agriculture. And in a lot of watersheds, like this is national, a lot of watersheds out in the Midwest, the only thing in the watershed is agriculture. And NRCS has a program called EQIP, Environmental Quality Initiative Program. And it kind of mirrors the 319 program that EPA and the state environmental agency administer. And EPA said to NRCS, hey, you should be spending your money on these impaired watersheds that are mostly agriculture. And that's where the partnership created. And so the idea is for farmland in these impaired watersheds, NRCS will take the lead and work with the farmers. And there's a special pot of money that they have access to and technical assistance that areas outside these designated water bodies. And there's 2 in the state of Maine right now, Cross Lake Watershed and Sheepscot Downstate. So there's targeted money and assistance going to Cross Lake. And part of that process is you have to identify where to spend this money. And NRCS developed the Cross Lake Watershed Assessment. So in the process of doing that, identifying where the problems are, NRCS used some GIS tools and put the layers of where the vulnerable soils are, the critical source areas, where the farmland was, and they looked at practices that had been done in the past and modeled out where the problems were coming from. So that's how they identified because there's so many fields and everything, you can't go out and individually survey it like you did your residential sites. And the fields are large, so this is their process for identifying where the agricultural problems are coming from. So the water quality assessment goals for this National Water Quality Initiative for Cross Lake, their goals for 2020 to 2023, which is the extent of the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is passed every 5 to 10 years, depending on what Washington, D.C. does. The current Farm Bill, which includes funding and technical assistance, ends in 2023. So they set up the goals based on the current Farm Bill because they know what the rules and amount of allocation will be through that period. And, oops, there we go. For a while, it wasn't responding again. So the goal is to reduce it by 555 kilograms of phosphorus by 2023, which is it's a big chunk. They've got a 15% reduction from cropland. They spelled out all the different conservation practices in the areas and their goals on what they wanted to see completed. This is being handled by both the state office, and for those of you who know Eric Iverson and his great staff, are working to implement this program. Oops. My mouse isn't. So agriculture is being taken care of. We've talked about the residential and development side. Then that leaves forestry is the other big land use in the watershed. We don't have enough data to really comment on the impacts. Jen's going to talk a little bit about the modeling later and what the model says, but this is an area that we're going to work with Maine Forest Service and Irving and deal with the forest lands, keeping a track of them so that road sites that won't be stable this year and then we have a big storm wash out another year, or harvesting practices to make sure they don't impact the lake. So a little bit about kind of watershed and the water quality. You can see that if 94% of the influence on the lake is coming from the watershed, if the watershed is cleared and developed, and we have data that shows for streams that 10% development in a watershed for a stream, you start seeing impairment. We know that when a lake watershed is less than 76% forested, we can start seeing impact. And we know that Cross Lake is 45% forested. So we're seeing impacts from the watershed, the land use development. And that's why we say that the lake water quality is a reflection of the watershed. So the more disturbed, used the watershed is, the more chance you have to impact the water quality. So there's things we can do to limit that impact, which you guys have already been learning about through like the road workshop, Lake Smart, and those kinds of activities. And I'm turning this over to Amanda now.
All right, here's your next poll question. In the direct watershed, which sub-watershed do you think may contribute the most phosphorus to Cross Lake? And so you've got the map there. So Basin A is directly around the lake. Basin B is the land area draining to Daigle Brook. Basin C is the west fork of Dickey Brook, and Basin D is the east fork of Dickey Brook. So go ahead and take a guess as to which one might contribute the most phosphorus. We'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, looks like most everyone has voted. So it looks like 20% think Basin A directly around the lake is contributing the most phosphorus. 12% think Basin B, Daigle Brook. The majority at 52% think it's the west fork of Dickey Brook, and 16% think it's the east fork of Dickey Brook. All right, so we're going to hear from Jen now for more on that.
And Kathy, I need you to let go of control. Here,
And
thank you.
Great. So now that Kathy's put some context to phosphorus and where it comes from, I'm going to talk about the results of the watershed modeling work that was done as part of the watershed plan process. So watershed modeling is a way in which we can estimate how much phosphorus is getting to the lake and where it's coming from. So from a geographical perspective, where do we expect the most phosphorus to be coming from? We start by creating a map of the drainage areas, which Kathy had showed you earlier. So the colorful areas on this map represent the direct watershed of Cross Lake, which for modeling purposes was divided into 29 different sub-drainages. The upstream or indirect watersheds, as shown in gray, also have a role to play in the total phosphorus load. So Long Lake, the McLean Brook, and Mud Lake all contribute to the total phosphorus load to Cross. Okay. So land cover is an essential element for estimating phosphorus load. And so this is kind of the base of our model. The more intensive the use of the land, the larger the water and phosphorus load that's getting to the lake. So one thing I see when I look at this map, and you guys probably can see this, is that these orange and yellow areas, there's a lot of it in the upper watershed. This is agricultural land, representing hayland, cultivated crops, pasture. And then the different shades of green are different types of forested areas. And then the wetlands are the lakes, and the blue shades and greenish blues are wetlands that surround the streams and the lakes throughout the watershed. As part of the analysis, we made some adjustments to the land cover layer that we had access to. So on the left, you have the before data, and then after the adjustments were made on the right is the final land cover layer. So we modified the layer to add in roads that didn't show up. You can see there's a little bit more red area around the lake. That's developed land along the shoreline. And I will point out that due to budget constraints, we did not separate actively harvested forests from forest land. So we tried to account for that in the model as best as possible. So an assessment of the land cover data shows us that close to 1/3 of the watershed is in wetlands. So that's represented by the blue in the pie chart, which is a good thing because that wetlands typically can help hold on and filter sediment as it's washing down through. 45% is in forests, mostly managed forests. 23% is agriculture, which is the orange. And 3%, a smaller slice of the pie, is the developed land that's primarily around the lake and along the roadways. So in order to figure out how much phosphorus is coming off this, we apply phosphorus coefficients to the various land cover types to estimate phosphorus. And when we compare the export to the land cover, what we see is that while 23% of the area is in agriculture, 77% of the phosphorus load is attributed to the agricultural land. Compared to with wetlands, we had 29% of the land cover, 9%, 45% forested, only 10% of the total phosphorus load. So because timber harvesting was not broken out as a separate land cover type in the model, we might expect that the total load from forest land might be slightly higher than is represented here, maybe as high as 10%, which would lower that load from agriculture by probably a pretty close to equivalent amount. When we add in other sources of phosphorus, so that watershed load I just showed you, go ahead, Cheryl, is represented here. So 4,726 kilograms of phosphorus per year is delivered from the watershed. And then we look at the other sources. Kathy showed you on that diagram, the atmospheric deposition. So coming in from the air, the internal load from the sediments, waterfowl, and septic systems. You see that the watershed load is a huge percentage of the total load, 94%. And when we break that down even farther into the direct watershed and then the indirect watersheds, we see that the direct watershed accounts for 55% of that watershed load. So the bottom line is that the watershed load in Cross Lake's direct watershed should be the main focus of phosphorus control efforts for Cross Lake. And remember the 26 subbasins I mentioned earlier? Well, they're presented in this maps in terms of phosphorus export per unit area. So the darker colors represent the areas with the highest phosphorus loading. And this information can be used to set priorities for addressing soil erosion and where to focus efforts and funding to address problems that are in the watershed. So the West Fork of Dickey Brook is estimated to have the highest load per area and should be prioritized in the management plan, as well as Daigle Brook, which you can see next door to the south, is a little bit lighter shade, but still darker than the rest of the areas around the lake. And then lastly, the watershed model was used to generate various phosphorus reduction scenarios and water quality targets. So the water quality target's super important for the watershed management plan because this is what we're basing all of our efforts on over the next 10 years. How do we get to the target that we're selecting? So we wanted to pick something that was practical, achievable, and all of the scenarios that are presented here from 17 parts per billion, which is the current, meaning do nothing, and maybe it gets worse, all the way down to 10 parts per billion. So this table was reviewed by a technical advisory committee and who weighed in on it. And the committee selected 14 parts per billion as the new target. previous target was 16 parts per billion. We deemed that that target would not make the kind of improvements we're hoping to see to improve the water quality. So we went lower. This is considered achievable in a 10-year planning period based on the NWQI. Go ahead, Cheryl. Which basically sets the NWQI, which Kathy talked about, estimated they could reduce 900 kilograms of phosphorus from the watershed over a 10-year period. So overall, this will improve water clarity, and it will lower the probability of having algal blooms in the lake from 21%, which it is now, which you can see in that bottom line, percent of time chlorophyll A is greater than 8, is 21% right now, to a little over 9%. So you,
Sorry.
the chance of having a bloom are still there, but they're substantially lower with this lower target. So keep in mind that the concentration of water coming out of Mud Lake is 14 parts per billion. So very much in line with what the target is for Cross Lake. And this target could be revised to be lower 10 years from now if at that time it's considered achievable.
All right, so now we have your next poll question. This question is, given what you have just learned about Cross Lake's water quality, the impact phosphorus has and where it comes from, which of the following has the greatest chance to improve the water quality of Cross Lake? And so you just choose the one that you think is the best answer. And we'll give you just a few seconds to pick which one you think. All right, please get your vote in if you haven't yet. Still a few trickling in here. All right, I'm going to cut it off right there. So our answers are 7% Maine Land Use Planning Commission. Nobody said Maine Forest Service. 14% Maine Department of Environmental Protection. 7% US Environmental Protection Agency. 29% said the United States Natural Resource Conservation Service. And most people said the people and companies who own or lease property in the watershed at 43%. All right, thanks.
Okay, it's my turn. And those of you that said the people that own or lease land in the watershed were actually correct. All of those governmental agencies can help us, but it's completely up to the people that either own the land or lease the land in the watershed to fix the problems on their land. It's a voluntary process. There's no enforcement. So I'm going to start out with the fact that this has to be a local process. We've had an incredible amount of partners from the start, and I'll go through just really quickly what we've been doing. We actually started Friends of Cross Lake on August 4th, 2018. We had our first organizational meeting then. In June, we started June 8th, 2019 about the watershed survey. We had partners of DEP, Ecological Instincts, Maine Forest Service, the Natural Resources Conservation Service did do the ag land with UMFK, and they had drones. Then we started the Secchi Blitz in 2019 in June. We had DEP and the Lake Stewards of Maine train our volunteers. EPA came up, I'm trying to show how many people have helped us with this. EPA came up and did the bathymetric survey during July of 2019. And it's very lucky that we did all of this work in 2019 before COVID. So we had all these group processes. August 2nd, we had the state soil scientist come up, and he did a gravel road workshop with DEP and the local soil and water conservation district. And then in 2019, we also sampled the wetlands and streams with DEP, and the National Water Quality Initiative project was started. That had nothing to do with us, other than they did talk to us and work with us when they were developing it. Then Lake Smart, we started a Lake Smart program in August of 2019 with Maine Lakes, another partner. And in 2020, we started on this watershed-based management plan with ecological instincts and water resource services. Those were our consultants. And the SECI Blitz was ongoing. And then in 2021, the watershed-based management plan is almost done. It will be done. It's in final review with DP. We're still continuing our SECI Blitz, and we're going to apply for a 319 grant. So this is kind of the process, and we have really gone fast with this process. It's kind of unusual to do. This is the watershed-based management plan is usually a 2-year project, and we've done it in 8 months quicker than that. So what are the steps to fixing Cross Lake's problem? I should probably turn this to like I said, it has to have a local initiative, and the watershed survey is the first step. So we did that in 2019 with the Lake Stewards of Maine grant, and the report is available online if anybody wants it. It's was done in February of 2020. Then we had to develop a watershed-based management plan. So we got a EPA grant in 2019. Jen has already talked about the water quality analysis, the land cover and modeling. We set the water quality goals. The last thing is the action plan and milestones, which I'll be talking about in just a minute. And all of that's in the draft watershed-based plan. If you sent me your email address, I sent you a copy of that. The last step in this 3-step process is applying for grants. It's called EPA Section 319 grants to fix the problems. And that involves DP and EPA approval. They have to approve the plan. They're not just going to give you money and say, here, do what you want with it. They have to look at the plan and say, yes, these are good ideas, or no, you should do this. So we are going to apply for a 319 grant, and then hopefully it's competitive, we'll obtain funding and implement the actions that are in the plan. So why do we need a watershed-based management plan anyway? Well, this is a picture, again, Google Earth, a satellite image on October 11th, 2020. You can see this is Cross Lake, and it's green. Square Lake, Eagle Lake, even Madawaska Lake isn't green. Mud Lake's a little green, and Long Lake is fine. So Cross Lake has a problem, as we've already discussed. A management plan is needed to guide the efforts to restore the water quality. In other words, like I said, they're not just going to give you the money and say, here, you figure out what to do with it. You have to have a plan. It's also required to get any funds to fix sites. So what are the steps in this watershed-based management plan, which is really what we're talking about today? You have to have project meetings. We had a technical advisory committee, which was great. We had a couple of steering committee meetings where people on the steering committee provided input. And then the public stakeholder input, we had our last annual meeting in August of 2020, and then this meeting. So Jen already talked about these things, what we were doing. That's part of the watershed-based management plan. You have to analyze the historical water quality. You also have to do the modeling, which she talked about, and we use that to set the water quality goals. The last thing is the action plan and targets, and review and final approval of the plan. Then you can apply for a grant. So what are the plan goals? We're talking about the plan. The plan goals are that Cross Lake has fewer algal blooms and meets the state water quality standards. We're currently on the Maine DP list of impaired water bodies, and our goal is to get off of that. So how do we do that? Well, you saw Jen said we set the in-lake total phosphorus, TP is total phosphorus, goal to 14 parts per million, which is parts per billion, sorry. It's 3 parts per billion down from the current level of 17. We're also going to have better fishing, swimming, and water clarity, which is really what we all care about, that you would see. The next goal is the direct watershed phosphorus load, to reduce that from currently the direct watershed is 2,778 kilograms a year. Again, this came from the modeling that Jen did and Whitney that works with her, and the goal is 1878. So that's a decrease of 32% or 900 kilograms a year. And about 90 kilograms a year for 10 years would do it, would take care of it. So what are the projects that we're going to do? The first one is the NWQI project that really, our involvement is outreach and support for that NRCS project. That's for the farmers. The 319 projects that we're going to apply for, expanding Lake Smart and possibly looking at septic systems. So all of that will give us what we want, hopefully, which is happiness in the water. So the phosphorus load reduction estimates that were calculated, this came from the natural, the NWQI assessment. They calculated, there's a table in the plan, our plan, that I got from their plan, and this is what they got for 2020 to 2023. And then over 10 years, they said they could reduce it by up to 2,000 pounds, which is 900 kilograms a year. So you've seen that number 3 or 4 times, and that's a lot of where that came from. Then we also have shoreline erosion, which everybody, if you've been out on the boat, you've seen. This is my grandson. He helped Kirk look at some of these sites, and this is obviously shoreline erosion. And we have some just minor or not as significant runoff sites, and there's 4.7 kilograms a year was the calculations we got for that. There are formulas and things you can use to get these numbers. And then the gravel road sites, this is down by Miffs Lane, the landing road, that's the boat landing. There were some private and 3 town road sites, and those are 3 high impact town road sites, and these are 0.8 kilograms a year. So forest land and septic are also part of it, but we do not have sufficient data currently to determine the load reductions possible in those areas. That's part of the plan that we'll be looking at those areas more. So the total estimated reduction over 10 years is again, that 900 kilograms a year or more, if we can do more. And it will make a difference. And I did want to point out that although these 2 numbers are small compared to agriculture, we all need to do our part. We can address these sites and it will make a difference, especially where the shoreline erosion sites are so very close to the lake, actually on the lake. So here's in the plan itself, there's a huge table, I think it's 6 pages long, with all the actions we're going to do. And this is just a summary. And of course, one of the most important things is to address the watershed and septic system load. And you will notice this huge number here. It's almost $8 million, and the total is $8 million. This is the first slide where we really talked about money. And this comes from the NWQI assessment. This was their 10-year goal, all the practices that they think they might need over 10 years to achieve the 900 kilogram per year reduction. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to get that much money. It's just a goal, and we will certainly do all that we can to support that goal. So that's how come this is so big. The other thing we're going to do is keep tracking of internal load, because that is something we have to just look at annually. I keep a spreadsheet and I look at it annually to see if internal load is increasing with the monitoring we're doing. We're going to look for new sites and try to address them. And there's all of these numbers. I've got a spreadsheet with the calculations for these numbers in there. And again, they're just estimates. So education, outreach, and communications, obviously we have to try to reach people and help them learn what they need to do. And I will be asking in a little bit for volunteers for a communications committee. I've already assigned a couple people and they know it. We need to build local capacity. We need a fundraising committee. So I'll be looking for volunteers for that too. And I'll explain what it is too in a little bit. And lastly, we're conducting long-term monitoring and assessment. I do want to mention, I guess I can mention here now, I had it somewhere else, but Irving Woodlands has donated money the last 2 years to help with our water quality monitoring. And this year they are paying for it in full, our water, because we have no support. The very first year we did it, DEP paid for it, 2019, and then in a lab analysis is what I'm talking about. And then in 2020, we had the grant that paid for it. This year, we had no help at all, and Irving has agreed to pay for that completely. So the NWQI program, I did want to mention that big number that you saw, the almost $8 million. Here are just 3. They have a big table that has all the practices. There's 44 total. Doesn't mean they're going to do them all. These are just ones that they could do. And so here's 3 of them. This is one of the major ones, cover crop. You can see the date here is October 21st, 2015. And this is a cover crop in the foreground and no cover in the backfield. So that makes a difference. It's going to keep the soil covered through the winter. Grassed waterway, you can see that there's no bare soil here. This is all just grass where the water flows down through that kind of a gully. And irrigation reservoir. I know everyone's familiar, or most of you, with the term sediment basin. This is a similar thing, except for the water isn't outletted, so they can use it to water their fields. So the total 10-year needs, again, that big number. There's 44 different practices, and the Fort Kent field office will help determine the best practices to use for the farmers, depending on what they have for what their needs are, what they're willing to do. So this number came directly from the NWQI assessment to aggressively reduce phosphorus and sediment loadings to Dickey and Daigle Brooks and to Cross Lake. By the way, I don't think we mentioned yet that Dickey and Daigle Brooks and Daigle Pond, those are all listed as impaired water bodies. So our upstream water bodies are all impaired too for phosphorus loading. The NRCS NWQI practices that have already, this started last year, they started in 2020. So almost $100,000 was funded for practices in 2020. And as you all know, there were some issues in 2020, COVID-19 impact. There was a very short sign-up period, and they actually lost some personnel last year. So we're hoping, and they're hoping that it increases, but 9 contracts were signed. 2 of them completed early. Those were cover crop practices. So it happened last fall. Over 1,000 acres are going to be put in cover crops. They're going to repair 1 sediment basin and stream crossing, do 1. They're actually 9 practices, but I didn't want to overwhelm you with these slides because some of the tables are kind of full of information. But they're all in the watershed-based plan. So if you want to look at them, they're all in there. I think it's Appendix B has all of the full tables. Okay, so just some good news here. The draft phosphorus load reductions, whoops, I did that, I'm sorry. For 2020 could be as high, we haven't confirmed these numbers, but could be as high as 21% of the 4-year goals. And or as high as 13% of the 10-year goals, where if we're looking at 900 kilograms a year, we really only need 10%, which would be 90 kilograms a year. So that's good news that they could be on their way already. So what else is needed to fix our problems? You cannot do this without local support. Nothing will happen. As Kirk said at the beginning, DEP and EPA don't go into some lake that's impaired and say, oh, I think we should fix that. You have to have local people. This was our first organizational meeting on August 4th of 2018. As I said, the governmental agencies will give funding and assistance. We're doing our water quality monitoring on, I think it was May 7th of this year. There's still ice on the lake. That's Kirk. These are the people that got trained to do the Lake Smart. So we have 9 evaluators in Lake Smart. That's you. You take, anyway, it's Kirk. Property owners must be willing to implement the BMPs. This was a West Side Road, and that's Dax Plord, who was 6 years old at the time, helping to do the watershed survey. It's all voluntary. If someone doesn't want to fix something, it's not going to happen. And then farmers must be willing to implement conservation practices with help. Again, that's the NWQI program. There's no enforcement actions for non-point source pollution for soil erosion. It's not like a point source where you have a permit and DEP can pull your permit. It's not like that. It's all voluntary, so no enforcement action. So what can we control? Here's what we can control. We know we can control the shoreline erosion. This is actually St. Peter Road, and that site has been fixed from how horrible it was 2 years ago. We can control the gravel road erosion. This washed out culvert for a driveway. Actually, it's on Sear Road, and that has been fixed. We can control the runoff from camp lots. This is a big thing about Lake Smart. This lot should have a buffer of vegetation. It doesn't have to be that you can't see the lake. It doesn't have to be that you lose your view. It's just to protect the shoreline from erosion. This was in the watershed survey. Logging erosion and forest roads. Obviously, the big landowner in our watershed is Irving. They own almost 40% of the land in our watershed, and they have a pretty good environmental program. So but there probably are non-point source erosion sites. Agricultural runoff, we've talked a ton about that. We can control it. And the last thing is septic problems. If we look at them and do the work, these are all non-point source pollution, sources of non-point source pollution. So how do we do it? Our goal is to do it with the implementation grants and work with property owners in the project. So the first thing we do, this is kind of a timeline. We're going to apply. The request for applications came out yesterday. The proposals are due May 21st. So Jen and I will be working on that. The timing is the contracts can start in September or through January. So maybe in the fall, and finish 2 years from now. The projects we're going to be looking at, again, these are 40% cost share, 60% grant. So the grant can pay up to 60% of the work. We're looking at 3 cover crop practices for farmland. Kathy actually just got that worked out. Shoreline erosion sites and Lake Smart, and septic would be through other grants, and then maybe a town road site and some private road sites in the later phases. The phases of these applications are, we can apply every year if I can find the time and the energy, or every 2 years, and we're planning 4 phases for at least 4 phases for the 10-year period. And we can update that or amend the plan anytime, but we would require it to be updated in 10 years. It's a requirement. If you're going to keep working on the watershed, you have to have an updated plan in 10 years. Again, they won't just give you the money if you don't have a good plan how to use it. So we did ask for support letters. This is actually one. The county, by the way, is our grant fiscal agent. They actually apply for the grant, and we're their partner, the Aroostook County government. So this is from the Matt Walker. He's the state conservationist down in Bangor. He wrote a support letter and said he recognized the important value of the agricultural projects in Cross Lake's watershed. He mentioned the 2 numbers that you've seen several times: 555 kilograms a year in 4 years, 907 over a 10-year period is the potential for agriculture reduction. They're going to have about $1.3 million in the first 4 years, and the program is expected to be extended further. Annually, about $350,000 a year. So if that goes, they will get $3.5 million over the 10-year period, not $8 million, but we'll take what we can get, and they'll take what they can get. They also look forward to working with us. So we've had a lot of contact with NRCS in Fort Kent. 4 things. What are the things that you can do now as a shorefront owner? I know everyone here isn't, but you can plant or extend your buffer. This is actually a vegetated buffer on your shoreline. Again, it doesn't have to be so you lose your view. Join our Lake Smart program. We have 2 people that got awards in 2019. One of them's on crickets, one of them, because her property is Lake Smart. Like lakes, like less lawn, make it smaller and cover all bare soil. Friends of Cross Lake has some erosion control mix that you can use to cover soil where grass or other vegetation won't grow. And we're just charging what it cost us to purchase. So we have it here and we would love for anybody to use it that needs it. Septic systems, replace your septic system if it's before 1974, pump it out every 2 to 5 years anyway. Roads, again, gravel roads need to be maintained and participate in grant projects if there's one affiliated with your road, or be active in your road association. The last thing actually is to support FOCL, or if you have another lake association. I know we have someone here from Long Lake on the call, so become a member, join a committee, participate in projects, and provide financial support. So turn it over to Amanda.
All right, so this is your second to last poll question, and we're wondering what you're willing to do to help improve and protect Cross Lake's health and water quality. So based on some of the things Cheryl was just sharing, what can you commit to doing to play your part in protecting the lake? And you can choose any and all that apply.
Oh, wow.
Okay, we'll give you a few more seconds. Looks like most everyone has voted. All right, so 24% are willing to join FOCL, which, you know, at the beginning, the first poll, I think 69% or something like that were already members. So that's great if you're not a member to join. 86% each for making sure that their property is lake friendly through the Lake Smart program, and also reducing soil erosion on their property. So those are both 86%. Volunteer to help FOCL when and where I can is 62%. Work with FOCL to address a soil erosion site if found during the watershed survey on their property, 52%. And then 72% were willing to help make sure their camp road is not contributing to soil and phosphorus to the lake. So great, thank you all.
Okay, I think we just have a couple more slides here. I just wanted to point out these are our silly grandkids enjoying the lake. As you can see, they are in it every minute when they're up here, either on it or in it. And this is our grand dog. She enjoys the lake as well. So that's actually what we're doing this for, is for them. So the 3 committees that we need to continue with our work are the steering committee, which we had many people on the watershed plan steering committee that can continue on this. Going to meet twice a year just to discuss the action items, that big table that I mentioned in the plan, and goals to see if the goals are being met or maybe the plan needs to be changed. The communications committee is job is to discuss the plan objectives and determine the best methods to get information out and what goes into the information. We actually can get grant money to develop a website, and I've already talked to someone who does that, and she lives on Cross Lake, so that works great, and we will be pursuing that. Fundraising committee, review the funding plan and pay for water quality restoration projects and long-term monitoring. The reason I had the asterisks here is I wanted to remember to tell you that Irving has volunteered to donate the money to pay completely for our water quality sampling this year. I didn't want to forget to say that. and Amanda.
Okay, so our final poll question is asking, would you be willing to volunteer for the steering committee, communications committee, fundraising committee, or you can choose multiple. So if you're interested in more than one of those committees, choose as many as apply.
And if, if you do choose a committee, you can choose more than one, obviously, as Amanda said. Please let me know, like email me or message me through Facebook or let me know.
Because this is all anonymous, we don't know which one of you, who, how many of you or who is actually saying that, yeah, they'll be on the steering committee or whatever. So if you do actually want to be on these committees, email Cheryl.
Yes, so if you voted for one of these, make sure to follow up and let us know. And it looks like most of you have voted. So it looks like 22% are interested in the steering committee, 15 communications committee, 4% fundraising committee, 41% are potentially interested. So let Cheryl know if you have any questions about that. And then 37% would prefer not to volunteer at this time. But from our last poll question, we know a lot of you are interested in maybe not having a leadership position, but doing your part to protect the lake, which is great. So thank you for participating in all those polls.
So we, Kirk, this was you.
Oh, right. So, yeah, I guess you
Just say what it says.
just read it. Thank you for caring about Cross Lake. Yeah, for a copy of the final plan, contact Cheryl and more information about FOCL. You can read it just as well as I can.
You can message us on Facebook. I did get contacted through Facebook for some people, and we'll post the meeting on YouTube. If, of course, I forgot at the beginning, I asked someone to remind me and someone finally did, but we'll turn it back over to Amanda for the, she's the Q&A person for this meeting, and we'll take questions and comments now and go through the questions submitted in chat. I did notice while we were going along, there were quite a few questions in chat, so I thought they were really good. Some of you asked some really good questions.
Yeah, so I'll go through those questions in the chat box now. And if you have a question that you haven't already asked, go ahead and write it in the chat. Or at the end, if we have time, I'll open it up if you want to unmute and just ask your question live. We're going to go for about 15 minutes. And then after that point, if there's still questions, you can email them to Cheryl. And we'll get a list of all the questions out via email to you guys, so you have the answers. So the first two questions I'm going to ask to Jen, they're in regard to the water quality section at the beginning of the presentation. So one of them is asking about that statewide average that you compared, like the Secchi disc, the phosphorus, and the chlorophyll to. Just curious what percentage of the state's lakes are included in that statewide average, or the number of lakes maybe.
Yeah, so the number of lakes that are used in the average are slightly over 1,000 lakes statewide. Okay,
and the next question for you, Jen, is does boating or watercraft activity have an impact on those levels that you talked about, the chlorophyll and phosphorus and clarity?
It can, especially in shallow lakes, because boat motors can suspend bottom sediment. So when the sediment, when the boats go through very shallow water, it can stir up that sediment, and then that sediment has attached phosphorus, and that phosphorus then becomes available to the algae.
Great. All right, this next question, I think I'm gonna give to Cheryl or maybe Kathy. Do you know what caused last year's fish kill? Was it anoxia or temperature change, or something else?
I think Kathy can best answer that. I do know the answer too, but.
It's complicated. There were a number of things. It was like a confluence of the perfect storm. The fish had recently gone through the breeding cycle, and so they were worn out. We had really warm temperatures, and warm water holds less oxygen, so they were worn out. They had access to less oxygen. And to make matters worse, they also had a parasite in their gill, which again impairs their ability to get oxygen. So like I said, it was the perfect storm. It wasn't just Cross Lake. that had the fish kills. We had similar fish kills in other lakes around the state. I think there were about a total of 5 or 6, I'm not sure, but it was just a confluence of the perfect storm.
Okay, thanks. The next question I think was before Kathy's section on phosphorus. So I think this one got answered pretty well, but it was about how does heavy sediment loading impact water quality, specifically from Dickey and Daigle Brooks. And so I think Kathy, you already kind of talked about that in your slides. But basically phosphorus is attached to sediment particles. And so it's a big source. It's a major contributor. So I'm going to skip over that one. We also had a question about the shoreline erosion and how you would fix that. So I'm going to give that one to Cheryl and Kathy as well.
Yeah, I see the question and it says shoreline erosion can be fixed. Is that good news? Yes, the second question, obviously it's good news. And typically what has been done in the past is to stop it with riprap, which is not necessarily good for the littoral zone, which is the shallower parts of the water where plants and things grow. And so DEP, Kathy can add some to this, but DEP is getting away from that. If there's other methods to do it, we will look at some of them. Riprap still will have to be used on Cross Lake, some of the steeper sites. It always has to be combined with vegetation, a vegetation buffer to prevent the runoff from up above, from causing some of that shoreline erosion, although a lot of it is from high water and ice damage. So those are 2 methods. There are some ways to use natural woody materials to help protect it if it's not really bad. And Kathy, you may want to add something to that.
So some of the sites, you've got 2 things going on. You've got I'll say the toe of the bank, the lake level is high, and it's undercutting your bank. And so you've got that instability there. And then coming from above site, you've also got water because a lot of these sites, there's lawn and there's structures close to the edge of the bank. You've got this additional water that's not getting infiltrated and taken up by trees because it's not forested now. And you've got the water saturating the soils on the bank and you get slumping. So in some places you've got 2 things going on. In other places you just have the water level, the lake itself eroding the toe of the slope. So some of these are going to take a little bit more to permanently restore the problem. And if you look though, if you get an idea of how much the problem is, you can look at your shoreline, if there's some undeveloped shoreline next to where there's problems, and see whether it's stable or not. It gives you an idea of how much is being impacted by your development, your camp, your road, your impaction that's happening above, and how much is happening from the water level. Because Mother Nature does a great job of designing how she wants her system to work.
Great, thanks Kathy and Cheryl. The next question I'm going to give to Jen, and it is, do the land cover calculations in the model include slope as a factor in potential phosphorus contribution?
Unfortunately, no. The lake load and response model, which is what we used, does not. It's a simple steady state model that's used for planning purposes. The main inputs are land cover, precipitation, lake area and volume, with land cover being the biggest piece, along with the flow coming from the precipitation. So nope, the answer is no. There's a number of other assumptions that go into the model and some limitations to the model. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to get a copy of the modeling memo because it describes all of those limitations.
Great, thanks, Jen. The next question I'm going to direct to Cheryl and Kathy, and it was a question about some of the challenges or trade-offs of picking that water quality phosphorus target of 14. So what are the challenges of making that even more aggressive if we were to try to go lower than 14 parts per billion?
I could actually go, but I'm still sharing my screen, so I should go back to that slide if I can quickly. I don't know how far it is in probably this is not the quickest way to get there, but basically it's two things. One is our indirect watershed. Oh, this is not the right way to do this. Our indirect watershed. Oh, it's the next one though, or pretty close to this. Our indirect watershed from Long Lake, Mud Lake, and McLean Brook is 13 there. Okay, 13 parts per billion. Whoops, sorry. This is, Kirk took biweekly water phosphorus samples. Again, there's a lot of information we didn't give you, but he took phosphorus samples from the Mud Lake Thoroughfare biweekly every time that we took the other samples in the lake, and we got an average of 13. So to go below 13, if that is indeed what's normally the case, would be very difficult because that's what we're getting from our indirect watershed. So the reason we didn't go lower than 13 was mostly due to that. And also because it's, if you look at the amount of phosphorus reduction, it increases a huge amount as you go along here in these numbers, and it's just not practical. It's not, it would not, we could pick a lower number, but would we ever get there? So
Yeah, and the expense of going lower, it
This
can
is,
be not feasible. Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I was gonna say, this is a 10-year goal. If you get at the end of 10 years and you're at 14 parts per billion, then you think, again, you look at the watershed, you go through some of the same steps as the watershed management plan. Do we think we can get lower? So in 10 years, if you get to the 14, you can keep going if you think you can. No one's saying you stop.
That is very true. Yeah, so our next question is for you, Kathy. What do the farmers use for cover crops? What kind of plants?
So there's different, and I'm not a farmer, I confess, I just listen to them or try to. So some of them, depending on how early their potatoes are harvested, have a chance to spin on a grain or drill in a grain after they harvest their potatoes. But if you grow a russet, they harvest them too late. So they can't do that. They can't put cover on then. Some growers will, in their grain crop, underseed it with a clover or a multi-species mix. And then they harvest the grain and they leave that underseeded crop throughout the winter. And then some growers are experimenting with planting up to 10 species. I know down in southern Aroostook, and last year I think there's a 16 one of different species with legumes who would like fix nitrogen. I guess buckwheat is very good at making phosphorus available in the future for the plant because it has to do with the microbes. So it depending on, and then some of them use mustard. It's a natural fumigant to kill nematodes and some of the pathogens for potatoes. So it depends on their goal and what they would use. So it's something they work out with NRCS or their consultant on what species of plants to use.
Great, thanks. The next one is more of a comment about the importance of contractor training, following up on inspecting structures that are installed, and maintenance is another one that's really important. So that is a good point.
I do have a comment about that.
Sure.
At least for the NRCS program, and I believe for the 319 grant program, and Kathy can correct me if I'm wrong, maintenance is up to the property owner. There's no funding available for maintenance. They have to agree to maintain the structures for 10 years. And Jen, I believe you know that too for the 319 grants. Yes. So if someone agrees to do any kind of best management practice, it's up to them to maintain it. There's no funding for it.
And DEP does have contractor training through our non-point source training center. And that is being, John McLean, who took over, is revamping it. And due to COVID, he's done a lot of filming, and that's all going to be available online. But normally there's contractor training in the county somewhere, at least one area in the county, sometimes multiple areas, normally during mud season. and there's a certification process. And I know in the organized towns, and I don't know about unorganized, you can't work in the shoreline zone unless you're a certified contractor in organized townships.
Yep, yep, and it is a requirement when we do install BMPs, you have an operation and maintenance plan that you set out. They agree to maintain the practice for usually 10 years or the lifetime of the practice. So we do kind of include that, and if we spend a certain amount of money over a certain threshold, we're required to do an inspection afterward as well. But Kat, I think you might have had a follow-up question if you want to unmute.
I think you just answered it, Amanda. I guess that was
Okay.
my thought was you're going to spend $8 million in grants over 10 years here. Better get the money's worth out of it. And I think you just answered, if you're taking grant money, there has to be a maintenance thing in place. Otherwise, it could be all for naught. So I think you just answered it. That's what I was looking for.
All right, great. The final question in the chat is, do you know if there is a possibility to close the beach at the boat landing? I think that will be for Cheryl.
I can give a little bit of information about that. First, I'm wondering why they asked that, but and Kat, I don't know if you're involved in this at all, but Irving Woodlands is part of their concept plan, which was approved in September 11th of 2019 by the Land Use Planning Commission. Is in the process. It's not finalized yet, but the boat landing and Cross Lake is going to be owned by the county of Aroostook, it's donated to them. And they're just working out the lawyers, they're working out the legal aspects of that. So that is in the process. So the county will take it over. I'm sure they'll do a good job at maintaining it. And I don't know why it would want to be closed. It's the closest public access to the surrounding towns like New Sweden and Caribou and people in that area. So I think we need to keep public access. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is always looking for expanded public access to lakes in the area. So we do want the public to be able to access Cross Lake. And it's actually the only way really you can get to Square Lake is through the thoroughfare or the main way that people go.
Cheryl, I wonder if the question is in regard to like if you had an algal bloom, would it be closed?
Oh, maybe
Yeah,
that's
there's a
what they mean.
follow-up. Yep, talking about swimming because of the water quality.
Oh, that's, I'll start, but Kathy can probably follow in. Linda Bacon, who is the Lake Program Director, is working with the Maine CDC, who obviously is kind of busy with COVID right now, but working with the Maine CDC to develop a harmful algal bloom policy and protocol. And in our action plan, that 6-page table I was telling you about, one of the items in there is to develop an HAB protocol for Cross Lake. I want volunteers to help. I got a lot of people already who tell me when they see an algal bloom, and I took quite a few samples last year and sent them to Linda and also to EPA. So we're working on that. It's not in place yet. EPA has guidelines, and Jen and Kathy, you might have more to say about that.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Most important thing to remember, it's a catchy little phrase, but boy, I use it all the time. When in doubt, stay out. If you see green stuff floating on the water, I'm sure it's not going to kill you, but it can't help you and can certainly affect your pet. So if you have any question at all or any concern at all about getting in the water, don't get in the water.
But people may not know that if they're going to the boat landing, regular people who aren't.
When in doubt, stay out. Just, that's all I can say. We'll put a sign up or something on the beach.
Yeah, I know for other lakes that have had blooms kind of come and go, they have a system for putting signs up to say, there's an algal bloom, and something that says about the risk of swimming or boating. And if you have information about what the toxin levels are, they could be posted, but often we don't have the information until a couple of days after the bloom is peaked. So it might be something you guys consider. But you have Facebook, so that's a good way to get information out to people, let them know that there's an algal bloom happening.
Well, the county is also our partner in the grant application, this one and the next one. So we can work with them. But the thing is, when do we put a sign up. We have to be sure that it's not the wrong time, you
Right.
know.
And of course, these blooms, they come and go in minutes.
That's
I
what I
mean,
meant,
yeah, I mean, a windstorm will take it off the shore and get it back out to the water, out to the lake, and now the water's clear again. So you can put the sign up and then 10 minutes later, it'll be gone. So anyway,
All right, so that's all the questions that we had in the chat. And it's about 11, so we've had the 15 minutes for questions. So I think we are ready to wrap up. Thank you, Jen and Cheryl and Kathy, for the great presentation. It's been echoed very much in the chat.
thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, everyone. If you do have other questions, please email me or message me on Facebook. It's not a problem.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Stop share.